A young man walked into a garage sale. He had heard there were old video games being sold there, and went to check them out. He was an avid collector of Super Nintendo games, and had almost finished his collection. At his home, there were walls and walls of shelves filled with Super Nintendo games. Even a few NES games, too. They were all very neat, alphabetized by title. When he arrived at the garage sale, he looked around for the games. He saw several racks with clothes on them, some assorted lawn decorations, and a table with a balding man behind it who was reading a book. "Excuse me," he addressed the man. The man looked up from his book. "I heard there'd be video games here. Do you know where they are?" "I had a bunch of them. Some guy got here an hour ago and took most of them," the man replied. "There's still a few in back if you want to check them out." His eyes followed in the direction the man was pointing in. There were 2 folding tables in the garage, with empty shoe boxes on them. 2 of the boxes had games in them, one with NES games, and the other with Super Nintendo games. He pawed through the NES games. He didn't collect them, he just owned a few of the better games. Well, nothing in the bin caught his attention. He then turned his attention to the bin of Super Nintendo games. Games had been taken out of it, and there were gaps in between some of them. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket. It was a list of Super Nintendo titles, with some crossed out. And after looking through the bin, he didn't find any that were on the list. Except one, though, that caught his attention. The cartridge read, "Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends." Now, he didn't remember owning any game with that title, but it wasn't on the list. He pulled his phone out and tried to search for the game. No results. All stuff about Thomas the Tank Engine, but nothing about a related Super Nintendo game. He now felt he was holding something ominous in his hand, something that didn't belong in this world. He clutched the game tightly and brought it to the man. "Hi," he stammered. "How much for this?" The man looked at the game in his grip, and then back at the young man. "Let's say $10. The young man pulled $10 out from his wallet, put it on the table, then turned and walked away. He got home soon after. He lived alone, so the house was dark and silent. The faint light from down the hall invited him closer. He found himself in the room where his games were. T-H, he whispered to himself. His finger traced across the shelf, not finding what he was looking for. There he saw Tetris Attack and Thunder Spirits, but no Thomas the Tank Engine. He looked again at this mysterious game. He figured the only way to find out more was to actually play it. As soon as he turned on the game, he was greeted with Thomas the Tank Engine sliding into the screen. He had never liked Thomas's face. It always creeped him out, even as a child. The next screen had him chuckle. It read, "How are you?" with the options being 4 or younger, 5, 6, or 7, and 8 or older. As a joke, he picked 4 or younger. At this point, his nerves were settled. This was just some crappy edutainment game that people had forgotten about. Maybe even a bootleg. That didn't really matter now. One of the first things he noticed when starting the game was how awful the graphics looked. He was familiar with Super Nintendo graphics, but this looked more like an NES game. He was brought to a menu for the game, and there were different minigames available. A robotic narrator read the options. Start Thomas. Thomas quiz. Let's go with Thomas. The narrator had pauses in between each word it spoke. He didn't expect it to speak, though, and the whole narrator came as a surprise. It was quite eerie how lifeless it read its lines. He selected the first option, Start Thomas. It brought him to I guess you could call it a sliding puzzle. It wasn't really much of a puzzle, though. By pressing A twice, he had solved it. He decided that maybe he shouldn't have said he was 4. He looked around at the other games. None of them were too interesting. Basic games you'd expect from an educational game, anyway. After that, he picked the last option. Let's go with Thomas. Words lit up on the screen. Pick an adventure. He selected the second option, Thomas Saves the Day. The next screen had more options for the game, and... Auto? A red box contained the word Auto. How would that work? He selected Auto, and he now realized what this was. It was a story with words and pictures, sort of like a slideshow. The picture at the top unnerved him, though. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it seemed to look at him, though his eyes weren't in his direction. His thoughts were scattered by the sound of a voice. It was the robotic narrator again reading the story. It spoke the words but didn't read them. Just cold, emotionless. Every day, Sir Topham Hatt came to the station. "Hello," he said to Thomas. "Don't let the silly freight cars tease you. You have an important job as a special helper in the yard." On the third screen, the narrator didn't speak. The only words present were, "Who is this man?" In a second, the screen disappeared and the story continued. At this point, the narrator's voice was freaking him out. He didn't hear the story, but listened to the words, the voices. And then there was silence. He looked back up at the screen that was illuminating the room. Another question was asked to him. He looked back down at the ground. The narrator's voice began to fill his head once more. "Help, help," said the emotionless voice. On, laughed the same voice. "Hurry, hurry, hurry." At this point, the music had slowed down significantly. It felt sad and hopeless. They found James in a field. "Help, help. Serves you right. Serves you right," the voice echoed. The man was kneeling on the floor. The controller was out of his hand, but the game continued to play. A puddle of drool was forming on the floor in front of him. The game ended. The screen turned black. The console had reset itself and was playing once again. Thomas slid into the screen and looked directly at him. "Serves you right. Serves you right,"